I'm David Kaloustian, chair of the Department of Language, Literature, and Cultural Studies at Bowie State University. And I'd like to welcome everyone to this edition of the Anti-Racism Communities and Collaboration series. Many thanks are in order to those who are responsible for making this event happen. I would first like to thank Dr. Tita Chico and her associates in the Center for Literary and Comparative Studies at the University of Maryland for establishing and curating this important and timely series. I'd also like to thank Dr. Monifa Love for initiating contact and exploring with Dr. Chico possibilities for collaboration between Bowie State University and the University of Maryland, of which today's presentation will, I hope and expect, be the first in many more. I thank Dr. Sheneese Thompson, who lends her considerable talents to lead our discussion today. Finally, I thank Professor Sufiya Abdur-Rahman for her presence here to discuss her book, Heir to the Crescent Moon, and other related matters. We here in the Department of Language, Literature, and Cultural Studies had the sometime privilege and honor of working alongside Professor Abdur-Rahman when she was here at Bowie State University. And although, of course, we lament her departure, we rejoice in her continuing successes, and we congratulate her accordingly. So again, welcome all to what promises to be a first-rate discussion. And now I'll turn the floor back over to Dr. Chico for introductions of our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I want to welcome everyone to today's program, which is co-sponsored, as my colleague just said, by Bowie State University's English Department and the University of Maryland Center for Literary and Comparative Studies. Today's conversation is part of our series, Anti-Racism, Communities and Collaborations. And this series features scholarship, teaching, and public engagement to reimagine boundaries, to model anti-racist literary and rhetorical inquiry, and to foster collaborative relations across and beyond campus. We're delighted in this spirit to partner with our colleagues at Bowie State. Today's event and our second collaboration on March 14th, I'll include information in the chat, are imagined too in support of the spirit and the work of the Bowie State and UMD Social Justice Alliance that honors Lieutenant Richard Collins III, and that bridges our two campuses. With this programming, I want to say a few words that with this programming, we commit to art as a liberatory mode and a crucible of reckoning, the importance of community and communal histories, decentering whiteness, dismantling white supremacy, and refusing racism. And throughout, holding up and honoring the knowledge and creative work of Black, Indigenous, and other minoritized scholars and artists. We do this as we are situated, in my case, on a university campus built through wealth extracted by slavocrats from the labor of enslaved Black women, men, and children. And we also do this on the ancestral lands of the Piscataway people, to whom and for whom I offer this acknowledgement. We acknowledge the truth that is often buried. We're on the ancestral lands of the Piscataway people, who are among the first in the Western Hemisphere. We're on Indigenous land that was stolen from the Piscataway people by European colonists. We pay respects to Piscataway elders and ancestors. My many thanks to Dr. Karen Nelson and the graduate assistants who all work to keep the center going, Danielle Griffin and Shannon Neal. And I want to offer my very, very special thanks to Dr. Monifa Love, Professor of English and Associate Dean at Bowie State, for making the steps to forge this connection. I'm forever grateful. And to my colleague, David Kaloustian, the chair of the English Department. Today, we are very honored to welcome two brilliant minds who will be in conversation for an hour. Our first guest is Professor Sufiya Abdur-Rahman. Her writing investigates questions of family, identity, race, and religion, and often how they intersect. Her articles, essays, and criticism have appeared in publications including Catapult, The Comment Online, Gay Mag, The Washington Post, Chicago Tribune, and NPR. She's earned a notable distinction in Best American Essays, received fellowships from the Sustainable Arts Foundation, and is a two-time alumnus of the VONA writing workshops. She's Creative Nonfiction Editor for Cherry Tree, a national literary journal at Washington College, where she teaches nonfiction. And she is winner of the Iowa Prize for Literary Nonfiction for her astounding book, Heir to the Crescent Moon. Dr. Sheneese Thompson, with whom she'll be in conversation, was born and raised in Philadelphia. Through her participation in the Philadelphia Freedom Schools program, she was introduced to Africana Studies and decided to pursue the critical study of the African Diaspora's cultural and intellectual contributions. She earned a BA in Afro-American Studies from Howard University, her MA in African American Studies from Boston University, and a Ph.D. in African American and African Studies from The Ohio State University. She is currently an assistant professor and interim course coordinator for first-year writing in the Department of Language, Literature, and Cultural Studies at Bowie State University, specializing in Africana literature and film. And with that, I will turn my microphone off and turn this over to our guests. Thank you.
Hi. I'm going to yield the floor to Sufiya so that she can regale us with a wonderful reading of a passage from her latest work, Heir to the Crescent Moon.
Thank you so much, Sheneese. Hi, everyone. Although I can't see you, I am so honored to be here, so honored to be part of this conversation about anti-racism. I just wanted to start by acknowledging, as you mentioned, Lieutenant Richard Collins, who unfortunately was killed while I was at Bowie State University. Want to remember him, as well as acknowledge that this is the 2-year anniversary of the killing of Ahmaud Arbery. And just to recognize that, unfortunately, we still have to work against racism because it's still here every day, and the work continues. So with that, I will read the opening chapter of my memoir, Heir to the Crescent Moon, which is the story of a second-generation Black Muslim, the daughter of 2 converts to Islam from 1970s New York City, the Black Power era. And in it, I'm searching for connection to my faith and to my parents and their past. And so I will just read the opening to that story to you now. The prologue is called My Father. Before I even understood what a Muslim was, I knew I wanted to be one, because my father was. Both of my parents were. This meant that I was too, but simply being born Muslim was not enough. When I was 5 years old in 1984, my father taught me that being Muslim is something more. He had a way of gliding into a room, walking on the balls of his feet like his heels were too good to touch ground. His steps were soundless that day, except for the faint swishing of his ashen soles across our cheap linoleum. I watched him as he strode from the hallway into the dining room, fingering a string of beads in his right hand. I had seen them before, hanging from a nail in the wall of his office at the opposite end of the hallway most of the time, and clenched in his hand at others. The beads were simple, plain brown, perfectly round, smaller than marbles, but bigger than sweet peas. They were strung together like a necklace, except where the clasp should have been, 1 or 2 or 3 extra beads jutted out and led to a stiff brown tassel hanging from the end. The flattened tips of my father's thumb and forefinger pinched each globe, then inched along to the next, the string of beads rotating in his grasp like stairs on an escalator. He did this while walking into the kitchen and over to the living room, with his fingers at my eye level, almost as if unaware of the movements they were making. "What is that, Abi?" I asked my father, still eyeing the beads instead of looking at him. The little circles were plain, but pretty, and seemed like the kind of thing a girl like me should have. Dainty due to my size and fragile because of my timidity and penchant for bursting into tears if even looked at unkindly, I was often treated like a girly girl. Never mind that I hated dresses, dolls, the color pink, and any doubt that I could keep up with a boy my age. I thought if I asked nicely enough, my father might give the beads to me. He sat down in a chair, face backward from the dining room table, and gathered me onto his lap. His caramel-complected face stared into mine, except his was framed by a low, dark afro behind his receding hairline, and a full black beard shading his jaw and chin. These are zikr beads. They're for praying, he said, still not holding them out for me to touch. But you're not praying, I said. You're not even saying anything. I'm praying in my head, he explained. You don't always have to pray out loud, but Allah should always be on your mind and in your heart. My father used the hand not holding the zikr beads to point at my head and chest. I knew by then that Allah was God. My father most often referred to him as the creator. He created the sun, the moon, the stars, the land, and all the people on it. And for that, we worshiped him. My father uncurled his fingers to show me the beads lay lightly across his palm. It was here, in his hands, that I'd get lost in the intrigue that was my father. I'd grasp his fingers and stare at the back of his hand. It bulged with pulsating veins I pressed down on and watched jump from side to side to avoid my index finger's pressure. I turn his hand over and study his palm, the intricate conglomeration of lines, fingerprints, and creases so deep and dark, they were like crevices, dangerous erosions formed over time, through stress, and to be avoided at all costs, unless I could learn to read them, figure out what they meant. And so I held his hand at different angles, under varying lights, compared it to my grandfather's hand, and traced both of their creases with my tiny fingertips. Still, I couldn't decipher Abi, but I knew something was there. With the zikr beads obscuring his headline, lifeline, and fate line, my father explained there were 2 sets of 33 beads on the string and one of 34, a set for each Arabic saying he would silently utter in remembrance of God, his prayer. The beads helped him keep count. I realized then that my father would not be giving me the necklace. It was too important. I was still curious about it though. How come we don't pray that way? I asked, referring also to my 10-year-old sister and 2 brothers, 8 and 3. We prayed in Arabic, but never with beads. You all don't have to do what I do, Abi said, his voice losing the levity it had taken on in talking to me, a child, and assuming its accustomed depth and deliberate diction. Your mother and I are Muslim. We chose to be, but we're raising you all to be whatever you want. It felt as though he were admonishing me. I didn't know what I'd done to deserve it, but my shoulders tensed and my back went stiff, as if sitting still would keep me from upsetting him further. Abi's tone told me that I was to take his words seriously, but I had a hard time understanding what they meant. I knew that besides Muslims, there were Christians. Everyone in my extended family was Christian. Yet except for going over my grandparents' apartment on Christmas, where silver pine needles sporting multicolored metallic spheres jutted from a miniature tree atop a glass table, like some frozen relic from the ice-covered North Pole, we didn't do anything I thought could be considered Christian. The only other religion I'd heard of then was Buddhism. And that was simply because of the mahogany brown ceramic Buddha figurine the size of my stuffed hippo that sat perpetually plopped on an edge of the coffee table in my family's living room. My little brother and I sometimes rubbed its fat belly for good luck. We made no attempts to worship it. So I didn't see how my parents were raising us to be anything other than what I knew we were, Muslim. Nevertheless, I listened as Abi continued. When you're ready, that choice will be up to you, understand? I nodded yes, but didn't mean it. I only understood that I was what he was, and I would do what he did. He was my father, so I got my name from him and my looks from him, according to all the relatives and friends who constantly reminded me, and I was to follow where he led. The prospect of doing something contrary seemed nothing less than wrong. And yet, my father told each of my siblings and me the same thing, that it was his choice to be Muslim, but it didn't have to be ours. Over the years, he would come to rely on this refrain to avoid in-depth discussions of Islamic practices or detailed explanations of Muslim beliefs. He meant it to liberate us, to free us of the burden of being bound to a religion. But it didn't feel that way. I'm Muslim, he'd say, his tone drenched and dripping in confidence, defiance, and pride. But you all don't have to be. he'd add, dismissing us outright. Each time he said it, I wondered what Abi knew about Islam that he wasn't telling us. What hurt did he suffer in Islam that he thought, with a father's protection, we could avoid? When Abi held my tiny torso within his hands, the string of prayer beads dangling by my side as he lowered me onto the floor, I felt certain that I knew what he was really trying to say, what he couldn't admit, but secretly wanted. It was that I be what I felt I was supposed to be, was born to be, Muslim, just like him. Thanks.
Yeah, I know that Zoom doesn't lend itself to a round of applause, but I have to imagine that it's there. And I have to thank you so much for gifting us with that reading. I had the distinct pleasure of reading this book myself, but it's such a gift to be able to hear it in your own words. And I have to just say kindly that your use of language throughout, right? Descriptive, you were able to transport me into some of these moments. And I think it's just such a gift. And I just have to thank you for sharing it with us.
Oh, thanks so much. That's so nice.
Oh, no, it's really wonderful. And I think that leads me to my first question here, which is what inspired you to use the memoir as a forum to explore your story? And maybe what do you find particularly useful about the memoir in telling stories for Black liberation?
Okay, great. Well, to be honest, I really didn't want to write a memoir. It was not my first choice. By training, I'm a journalist. I got my undergraduate degree in print journalism from Howard University. And so I started off as a newspaper reporter. And when I had an idea for a book to tell the story or a story about second generation Black Muslims, my idea was interview people, around my age, from my generation, about their experiences growing up with their parents and people around them, maybe include a little bit of my own family story, but that was not going to be the whole story. And I went to grad school and started working on this project. And I did that, interviewing people, adding a little bit of my own family story. And the more that I gave my classmates my story, the more they wanted more of it. And they were like, this is actually really good, let's see some more. And I had started writing a little bit in the first person by that point, writing some essays, but I was not yet comfortable enough to write a full-length book that was in the first person. So it took, some convincing for me to really go down that route. But I ended up finding that it worked for me because it gave me the opportunity to really go deep in terms of the thoughts that, are in a character's head, to get to know them more intimately than you probably could if you were doing it journalistically and you were doing multiple characters, because that was my idea, to do multiple characters. So each one would only have a little bit of time and space. With this, you stick with just a few characters, but for the length of the 200 something pages that are there. And I feel like the memoir just offers that level of closeness between people. And that was my primary reason for wanting to tell the story in the first place, is that I didn't feel like there was enough out there that let the public know who Black Muslims were and are. And I said, well, that's a problem. And that's something that needs to be solved. So I need to write this story. And the fact that its story ended up being about my own family is, it's neither here nor there, but the story is still one piece of this Black Muslim journey. And I feel like other people can add on to it. And I hope that they do. And I have seen a lot more coming out recently. So I'm glad that the Black Muslim story is beginning to be told in a more full manner now.
Sure, absolutely. And it's so interesting that you say that in terms of representation, because I picked up this book and felt immediately at home. As you know, Philadelphia is an incredibly Black Muslim city.
Yes.
And so I was like, oh yeah, this is, I'm myself not Muslim and my immediate family is not Muslim, but many of my great uncles converted alongside with your father and your mother. So it's very interesting to have that, that parallel in your family. As you mentioned, most of my extended family is Christian, but here is this other thing. And, there was a passage in your book about, can you not cook with pork or that kind of No, but that being a real conversation, though,
Yeah.
right? And so traditionally in my family, like all the meat is seasoned with turkey instead. So it was like these small vignettes in the context of your story that you were telling that were so honest, right? You talked about the relationship between people and the intimacy, and that is all here in this narrative. So I just want to thank you again for convincing yourself, right? That story.
It was really my classmates, yeah, who convinced me to see it and through their eyes. And I was like, okay, I didn't see what you're talking about. So yes, I'll go along with this.
Excellent. And I'll ask a follow-up question about the memoir. Did you read a memoir that kind of inspired you in terms of the form, that kind of pushed you in that direction? Or was it just the goading of these people who really just needed to hear your story?
I mean, so many throughout the experience, I've read so many really great ones. I would say the one that immediately comes to mind, and let's see if I put it back on my favorite shelf, is Edwidge Danticat's Brother, I'm Dying.
Oh my goodness, yes.
I don't know where I put it. It's probably on a different shelf right now, but that book, it tells the story. Yes, I love her too. It tells the story of her growing up in Haiti with her siblings and her parents. And then I think her parents leave before she's able to come to America. So they leave and come to America, get set up. And then eventually they send for the children. While she's in Haiti, though, she's being raised by her aunt and uncle. And she just loves her uncle so much, like he's her own father. And so it's kind of like this love relationship between her father and her uncle. And in this story, she does go back in time and start telling her uncle's story when he was younger. And then you get to the later parts of the book when the uncle is older and he's still in Haiti, but the rest of the family's in America, and tragedy strikes. I'm not going to give any spoilers away for people who haven't read the book, but you should definitely read that. That as a memoir just kind of informed me about what you can do with one. It does not have to be this really continuous narrative of, and then when I was 12, and then when I was 13, and, because that was not what I wanted to do. And it didn't seem like something I was capable of doing. That style, a book that I read, a memoir that I read that I was like, oh man, this is amazing, but I could never do this, was Esmeralda Santiago's When I Was Puerto Rican. Because she just has, like, I was like, her memory must be amazing, because it seems like she tells every moment in time from one day to the next. And I'm like, I have no idea what happened on this day. There's no way I can continue that narrative. So mine is, more episodic. It's like I have this small moment where I can go into detail about that. And then we're skipping ahead several, weeks, months, years, whatever the case may be, and telling this next part. So yeah, I read quite a few and still do read some really great memoirs. I'm actually reading Fire Shut Up in My Bones right now. I'm a little bit late in reading that one, but it's marvelous as well. There's so many good books out there.
No, thank you. Excellent. I love that. And I have to say, just in reading it, like as a reader, my experience of it is so thematically consistent. Even though there is that skipping forward in time, it doesn't feel like so much time has passed in terms of your experience of the story as a reader, right? Because that thread is like you're constantly able to kind of hold on to and come back to, and it really makes for just like wonderful reading as an experience.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome. So let's come back to the book a little bit. You seem to be exploring identity or the lack thereof as much as you're exploring faith or the lack thereof in the text, right? So what choices did you make in your own writing to balance the tension between those two themes? Because they seem kind of central in the context of the writing.
Yeah, I'm not so sure that I see a difference between the two. I feel like for a lot of Muslims, Black or otherwise, their identity is Muslim first. And the other part may come after. It's like I may be Black after, or maybe, Saudi Arabian after, whatever the case may be. But that Muslimness is the first identity. And I feel like in the story, I'm trying to define my identity through faith, but also within a family, and also within a tradition, within a history, within a legacy, and just trying to figure all of that out probably at once. And so the faith is definitely part of the identity. As growing up as someone named Sufiya Abdur-Rahman, the question already begins. It's like, well, then what are you? Because they're looking at you and they don't really see the connection. And so you have to have a way to answer that question. And so that started when I was very young. People not knowing, like, well, what does that name even, where does that come from? I grew up in a predominantly white neighborhood, and actually probably a little bit more Jewish than a lot of places. So there were some people who were familiar with Arabic, but I don't think that they quite understood what it was to be Black and Muslim. And so that's a question that I've had to answer for a long time. And yeah, that's part of the reason why I wrote the book.
Absolutely. Thank you. This is so great. So you talk about being Black and Muslim, and that those identities, the Islamic part kind of supersedes the other parts of the identity in terms of the Islamic faith. And so that you're not seeing that the identity and the faith of it are separate. But one of the other things too that are kind of joined together are the political positions, right? In terms of Black power and Islam, they coexist in the context of your book. And I'm wondering, how might that be instructional for us in terms of building coalition in the contemporary moment as we're running up against anti-Blackness and anti-Islamic sentiment?
That's so tough, Sheneese, but it's a great question. And I will say that part of the struggle for me in writing this book was trying to find a way through words to join the Blackness and the Muslimness together. And it sounds weird because as a Black Muslim, they were together all the time. And so I didn't understand the separation of them. Like literally all of the Muslims that I knew growing up were Black. I didn't know any non-Black Muslims for a very long time, probably not until I got to college. And so to me, they were one and the same. It's like, well, of course I knew Black people who weren't Muslim, but all of the Muslims I knew were Black. So it was hard for me in writing to figure out, okay, well, what about this is specific to Black Muslims and not to all Muslims, Sure. And so that it by itself was a challenge. But I have to say, in terms of, the coalition building, there is a lot of anti-Black sentiment within Muslims. There is a lot of anti-Muslim sentiment within Americans. And so you get so much division within your own community and within the communities that exist that are larger, that surround yourself and your community, that it does become hard for people to build coalitions. And again, that's part of the reason why I feel like telling stories about people are really necessary, because once we get to know each other better, then we can see the commonalities, we can see the connections. My father likes to quote this surah from the Quran where he says that Allah said that he put you into tribes and people so that you may know one another. Not so that you can be divided amongst all these different groups, but within your groups, now you can reach out and find the other groups who are like you. You can find other people and find the connections between you. And I really feel like that's so true. Mm-hmm. It's like, yeah, we have our own little tribe here, but now as a tribe, let's go out and meet that other tribe and let's work together to get to that next step. And I think, yeah, that's so important, but it is really challenging. But the more that we tell stories about each other and read the stories about each other and figure out, you know what, I'm actually not that different from that person. I think that's just the beginning of being able to see each other as human and bridge those divides.
Sure. And let's stay in the contemporary moment, right? You said that you didn't know any Muslims who were not Black until you got to Howard or until you got to college. And I would say that roughly the same thing is true for me. All the Muslims I knew were Black until I, ventured out of Philadelphia, let's say. And Howard University becomes a bit of a character in your book in terms of facilitating identity development for you. And recently, the significance of HBCUs has come back up as a topic of discussion in the midst of recent bomb threats to our campuses, right? And so what insights might you have to offer around the contemporary relevance of Black institutions and institutional memory?
Yeah, it's such a tough time. I mean, I'm now at a predominantly white institution, as they say. And so I'm kind of looking in from the outside, and my heart goes out to everyone who has to deal with so much just nonsense, to put it lightly, as you're trying to go to school and get an education and just, learn something. And yet it's disrupted at every turn. And so that's really frustrating. And, but I commend everyone who's working through that, because it's necessary. The work that is done on historically Black college campuses is necessary, remains necessary, will continue to be necessary. I think it's so important for people for young people in particular, to have an opportunity to learn themselves, to be themselves, to feel comfortable, to figure out who they are, to develop a sense of identity that can strengthen them before they go out into the world and face adversity. Now, adversity is going to come even if you're on a historically Black college campus in many different forms and fashions. And as Howard graduates, I think you know that there's lots to do. Then that A building is one.
That is the dominant struggle.
Yes, it is. That's the struggle right there. But the work that is done at historically Black colleges remains vital. And in terms of institutional memory, I really think, that there is so much that you hear about. Those protests that people have taken over A buildings for generations. I went to Howard, my husband went to Howard, my husband's whole family went to Howard. So like his parents remember A building protests in their day. And hearing about that inspired me when I was a student to do a little A building protest myself. It didn't go over so well, but I tried it out to see, will this work? Because this is what people do. You're supposed to like spend the night there. No, it didn't work. But it was, it was part of the experience. And so, yes, that part of the experience of being part of the struggle, being motivated to become an activist, which I hear in you, Sheneese, you're an activist, is part of the work that is done on historically Black college campuses. But at the same time, I think that when you mention institutional memory, that it's really interesting how certain things that you don't even know about start to work their way into your pores. And there's examples that, that are out there, but I was thinking recently about my nephew, who for you guys at Bowie State, you may remember that he went there during his freshman year while my husband and I were teaching there. We brought him, we're like, come to Bowie, be a freshman and come to school here. And he stayed, but he stayed only for a year. And we were heartbroken. We were like, we failed him. I can't believe he's dropping out of school. But afterwards, he went on and he found, his calling. He actually became an artist in New York City. And he found almost meteoric rise of success. And I said, well, how did he manage that? Because he has no training in art whatsoever. But Bowie has such a strong art program. There is such wonderful paintings all over the campus of Bowie State that making me think maybe it kind of worked its way into his pores while he was there and he didn't know it. And he later became a great artist. Anyway, his name is Amir Diop. You can find him on Instagram if you're looking for his art. It's great.
That's wonderful. It's so funny you talk about things working into your pores in terms of the experiential moment, right? Mm-hmm. I also brought my younger brother, who's much younger than me, to Bowie because I was really trying to bully him into going.
Isn't that what we do? Yes.
It was such a serious thing. And so I did. I brought him to campus. He spent the whole day with me on campus. He ultimately decided not to pursue higher education and he's learning at Trinity. So he's doing that, right? And he's doing great for himself. But it's like the inclination, right? To be like, no, you need this. And you write in your book, and I'm going to keep coming back to this book because it's too wonderful not to. And you talk about you're going to go to Juma prayer at Carnegie, and it's like, I've never seen anybody go in or out of that building. And when I tell you, I felt very seen. Carnegie's sitting there right on the main quadrangle. And you have never seen anyone go in or out.
Yes. How is that possible? But
I can tell you firmly that in the 4 years of my experience at Howard University, if I went into Carnegie once, it was a lot.
Did you? Had a class?
Because he had a class in there. Well, good for you, because I went in there maybe once, and it was something to do with the Department of the Divinity, and I don't know what it was that I needed to do, but one time. But it's so interesting that we talk about like how things come into your bones and your experience, right? So one of the things you mentioned in the context of the book that comes back for me in terms of like the institutional memory and the importance of the experiences at HBCU, right? And you talk about like feeling othered or different in your experience, and then coming to Howard and immediately somebody being like, hey, you seem like you're part of our tribe, right? So and that inviting experience. And it's so funny because I have a Muslim family, and I had gone to a mosque only once because in my entire upbringing, my aunt had gotten married, and she married into a Muslim family, and they had the marriage at a masjid. But in going to Howard, the second time that I went to a mosque was at Howard. It was a part of like my experience being there. It was like, okay, so I was a ubiquitarian, and so they wanted us to have exposure to all these different cultures and identities and religions. And so one of the things that we did as a group was go to a mosque, and they had a bazaar, and it was really wonderful. And it was like kind of reflective of the experience that you had, like in terms of getting on the bus and going over, and then all these Muslims and people selling. And it was very interesting to see. And you talk about, your husband's family, and they had gone to Howard, and they occupied the A building, and you occupied the A building. And I didn't occupy the A building, but I did occupy Blackburn. So you know what I mean? So it's very interesting to kind of see these intergenerational, these kind of passings of batons, right? That happen in terms of why certain things are important in terms of what training you get. And to come back to your nephew, I have to imagine that one of the things that he got was tenacity, because there's not a way for you to successfully matriculate through HBCU and not be tenacious. There is no way. At some point, you have learned not to take no for an answer. There must be another way around this. I am going to go around or through this, and I can't imagine my experience as a person, right? Like my full personhood, having not gotten that experience, being turned away at the A building first, because it prepares you in a way that I don't know. I can't describe anything else because I haven't had that experience. But there's a.
I think, at one point in time, while I was a student there, I said to myself, this must be purposeful. This must be part of the education, because there's no way that continually, semester after semester, year after year, they can continue to still do this and not be nice about it.
There's no way I continue to call here and you don't pick up the phone.
All right.
Or better yet, you picked up and then you hung up. There's no way.
Yes.
This is a test, right?
Right, exactly. It has to be. There's a hidden camera somewhere now.
Has to be. And so, I mean, is there anything in a general sense before we open it up to question and answer, right? Is there anything else that you would like to share with us in terms of your motivation for telling this story, or what you hope people get out of reading this story?
My main hope is that people read it. I'm so appreciative to everyone who opens the book and gets to that last page, because, there's so many things vying for your attention these days. And, the beginning of the book can be a little bit challenging because it's not all moonbeams and rainbows. So you may have to get through some of the tough stuff first before you can get to that other side. So I do hope that if you pick it up, that you don't quite put it down until you get to the last page. So thank you for reading, everyone.
I will say firmly that I could not put it down until I got to the last page. So I think if you pick it up, you won't put it down until you're done. Okay, I think that leaves us some time for question and answer here. If anybody has any questions that they want to post here, and then I guess I can read them.
While people are thinking of questions, I have one for you, Sheneese, because in the introduction, Dr. Chico mentioned the liberation schools in Philadelphia that you went to. Can you tell us some information about that? And is that something that you would consider writing about?
Sure, absolutely. And it is something I would write about. Philadelphia Freedom Schools, and it's so interesting. So I don't know how familiar people are with like the landscape of Philadelphia. I moved around a whole lot. If I was gonna write a memoir, the first 14 chapters would be about the different places I've lived, right? But I went to school, a charter school. Philadelphia is really deeply charter, and I know that varies geographically, people's position on charter schools, but it was a really viable option for parents during the time of my critical coming of age, because the public schools were just not safe, right? And so I went to a charter school which was safe. and the education was good. It wasn't great, but it was good. It was a solid foundation. It was a safe place for you to come and learn. And what I had, like HBCUs, because it's funny, my aunt, Veronica Joyner, she's my great aunt, opened this school, right? And it goes from 1st grade to 12th grade. I started in 4th grade, and then I graduated from that school. But in the 9th grade, what I had at Black institutions was a teacher who cared. Right. And so that's the thing. I think the merit of HBCUs is the involvement of teachers. There's like, oh, no, I'm going to grab you by your collar because you're going to go in this direction. Right. You don't know that you need this, but you do. And my math teacher, Mr. Waples, was like, you need this. And we walked across the street to the public high school, Benjamin Franklin High School, because that's where they were holding the session there. And I walked in, they were doing Harambe. What's Harambe, do you ask? And it was like they were doing these chants and these cheers, and they were getting all riled up, and they were excited about learning, which was important to me because I was a nerd. I'm like, these people are excited about the educational experience, and these are my kind of people, right? And it was like, okay, cool, we're excited about education and like being Black. And I'm like, this is my space. I'm gonna do this. And that was the exact experience. I was like, starry-eyed because I had not had the experience, because I think we all may have an experience about what it might have meant to be othered, especially like in your preteen and teenage years, right? For whatever reason. And I was always bookish. That's what one of my professors called me, bookish. And so I felt othered by that. I'm like, are you not doing the reading? Because this is riveting. And so I went and I found other people who were bookish. And then it was like bookishness about Blackness. And I was like, oh, this is like a double whammy. This is where I belong. And so they do a full-length summer. So they do a year-round program, but it was too late for me to enroll in the year-round program. And so I waited for the summer session because they do 6-week summer sessions. And it's like a intergenerational leadership model where they have classrooms for students who are 1st to 6th grade. And then they're being led by college students, so servant leader interns, and they have JSLs, which are high school students, junior servant leaders, right? So I applied to be a JSL, and I got hired. I was so happy, and we did training on HBCU campuses. So at the time, we actually did our trainings on the University of Maryland Eastern Shore campus. And so we do our training for a week, and then we come back, and then we do the summer, right? And so they had very specific curriculum around promoting literacy, right? And supporting literacy in these students who were in schools that were not very well equipped. They were underfunded and all that jazz, but also the cultural relevance, right? Culturally relevant curriculum before it was jargon, right? And so I did that for 5 years. I did it all 4 years of my undergraduate experience, of my high school experience, and I did it the first summer for my undergraduate experience. So the reason why I landed at Howard at all is because one of the directors of the program is was the chair of African American Studies at Howard, Greg Carr. And he helped write the curriculum for the junior servant leaders. And that's how I met him, because he would come to do talks with us every Wednesday, right? So it was a very interesting, so you're talking about activism, right? And I see my educational experiences as an educator as activism, because there was not really any reason that he needed, right, to engage with us in that way as a professor at Howard, the chair of a department. But every Wednesday he would come and talk to us, and we would be reading whatever he was teaching. So in high school, I was engaging with Nikhil Pal Singh, Carter G. Woodson, W.E.B. Du Bois, Claude Taylor. Like, it was like interesting, right, to have read all this college level academic text at that point, right? So I was in high school reading Black as a Country, and I'm like really negotiating race and nation, and it was like interesting, right? But I landed at Howard because of Philadelphia Freedom Schools, and my commitment to education, my commitment to Black education, my commitment to HBCUs comes from the idea that there was this community of people who saw in me what they saw in themselves, right? This kind of mirroring thing that happens. I am because you are, and we're all going to get there together. And it's very interesting. A lot of the people who came through with me in that cohort, many of them are educators. Like, they did not abandon the need to be doing education. If they're not doing education, they're doing educational policy, or they're doing policy, like councilmen and things like that. It's very interesting to see how it got in your pores, right? Because people take freedom schools wherever they go. And I know tons of people to this contemporary moment who I met in freedom schools who are working in very different spaces. And I walk in and be like, this is Harambe, okay? And I'm glad to see it, but we take it with us wherever we go. And it's interesting to see it as a network all over Philadelphia and in other places, to say like, oh yeah, definitely, we did freedom schools, and I was there and you were there, and now I'm doing this, and please come over here, and will you help? And it's really interesting because it is a coalition of Black educators who are committed to that work.
That's awesome.
Hope I answered.
That's great. Yeah, I hope you write about it.
I will think about that. Kelly Mickens, Dr. Kelly Mickens, she came out of Temple University. She works with St. Clover Freedom Academy, which is the Freedom School, right? So one of the things that we did through Freedom Schools was we wanted a real school. And so St. Clover Freedom Academy Charter School came from the lobbying of students who were participating in Freedom Schools to get a charter for that school. So St. Clover Freedom Academy, which is run by Dr. Imani, is functioning as a functioning full charter school, which also goes from 1st grade to 12th grade. And so Dr. Kelly Mickens, who did her PhD out of Temple, was also working with the Philadelphia Freedom Schools program, and she has written a book about some of the historiography of the development, right, of the particular program. But I do think there are other stories that can be told about the importance of the programming, for sure. So there are 2 questions here. Oh, 3. Okay. So Amadoma says, what advice can you give someone who is thinking about writing a memoir?
Okay. Hi, Amadoma, friend of my mom's. Everyone's a friend of my mom's. And so I think the best advice that I can give you to anyone who would want to write a memoir is to be patient with yourself. Because if you're writing a memoir about anything that is difficult, any difficulty that you may have had in your past, you have to take some time. It's probably going to be hard. I will just say that. There were times when I was writing this book, certain chapters, if they were hard to read, they were hard to write. I'll just tell you. If it made you cry when you were reading it, it made me cry when I was writing it. So you can't do that quickly. You can't get frustrated with yourself. You can't turn away and say, actually, I don't feel like writing this because I don't want to be depressed right now. You just have to take the time and be patient with yourself. So that's the best advice that I could give.
Excellent. The next question is from Dr. Love. And it says, the air of the crescent moon is beautiful and makes me look forward to more. What is next on your literary horizon?
Thanks, Dr. Love. I am trying to make my way through revising an essay collection right now. I've written what I think are all the essays. I'm not quite sure. I may have another one in there. One's kind of creeping into the back of my head right now. And so it's pretty much done, but I need to really work on fixing it up. And it's a collection of essays about love for Black men. And it's focused on all the men in my life. I have a lot of them in addition to my husband and my 2 sons. And I have my dad, my 4 brothers. And so there's just so many men that are surrounding me at all times, all of my nephews and everyone, that it works its way into my writing all of the time. So I just decided to focus on that. And as well as Black men in society. So I'm looking forward to getting that done within the next year or so. We'll see.
I'm looking forward to it also. So thank you for that question, Dr. Love. And then we have a student here, Sharon Collier. He says, hello, my name is Sharon Collier and I'm a student at Bowie State. And my question to you is, do you think that your book will help people understand the Black Muslim a little better?
I hope so, Sharon. It's just a start. It's not the full story of the Black Muslim experience, but it is one aspect of the experience, in particular out of Harlem in the early 1970s, and at this particular mosque. The mosque that I write about, that my parents belonged to, got started after Malcolm X parted ways with the Nation of Islam. He created an organization called Muslim Mosque Incorporated in New York City. And he didn't get much of a chance to get it off the ground, unfortunately, before he was killed. But the imam of the mosque that my parents converted in was actually, he got a scholarship from Muslim Mosque Incorporated to go and study in Egypt, in Cairo, at a university called Al-Azhar. And he studied Arabic and Islamic jurisprudence there for a number of years. And then when he came back to America, he started this mosque that my parents were part of. And so there is like a direct line from Malcolm X and his, when he became an actual Sunni Muslim after the Nation of Islam, that experience. So I do hope that there is some information, some lineage that you're able to find about Black Muslims through my book. And if you're curious about it, that you do more research and find more information about it that way.
That's excellent. I don't see another question, but your answer just gave me one, because you talked about lineage there, and it made me think about intellectual genealogy. And Dr. Love has talked about this, and she and I have talked about this in the past. And I'm wondering, right, because you talk about this lineage of this Islamic influence and how it has gotten, you know, one scholarship has put you in front of us, right, in terms of people's choices and decision making. And I'm wondering, even in terms of your writing, do you find that you're a part of intellectual genealogy in terms of influence from your own teachers or other writers? I mean, you mentioned Edwidge Danticat. I mean, how can we not love her? But at the same time, are there other people who have kind of been touch points for you in terms of your literary development?
For sure. I immediately comes to mind is James Baldwin, who's I use a quote from in the beginning of my book. You know, I think all nonfiction writers, particularly all Black nonfiction writers, kind of aspire to be James Baldwin or to do something like him, anything like him. But for sure, the one thing that I've been thinking about lately as I read my essay collection is, you know, what inspires me to get to the page more often than not is being frustrated about something and then having to write about it because I'm just so mad. And I'm like, you know, I have to say this thing pisses me off and and I hear that so much in James Baldwin's writing, how mad he was about the state of affairs in this country and how he would get on his typewriter probably at that point in time and then just type out these just sharp sentences that just would hurt you if you if you really took the time and read them. It's like, oh man, this is harsh. And so how could you not call yourself into question? How could you not try to make a change after reading something like that? And so yes, James Baldwin for sure is an inspiration. Yes, Edwidge Danticat. I actually like a lot of poetry as well. So, you know, people like Gwendolyn Brooks, Lucille Clifton, Yusef Komunyakaa. I like a lot of poetry too. And in nonfiction, let me think. There's a lot of great writers writing right now too, like Kiese Layman. Whose book did I just read that was really good? I'm thinking of Imani Perry. There's a lot of really great things out there. But I think for me, I'm probably more of I read things late, so I like the classics. And so yeah, older things are always inspirational for me. Right now, I'm teaching some Frederick Douglass, which, you know, when you go back to that, how can you not be inspired?
How can you not?
There's fire in there. There's fire in those words. Whew, yeah.
Okay, so Tita Chico has wonderful questions here. If there's time, and I think that there is, I wonder if you could talk about the structure of your memoir, beginning with your father and concluding with your son. What thinking went into this structure?
Yeah. Well, I feel like, again, in telling the story of a second generation Black Muslim, I'm already kind of putting myself as a descendant of something that existed before. And so it was important for me in telling the story to get that history that happened before I was around, before my siblings were around. So that's where, and you know, my father being the one who would kind of facilitate Islam in my household, it felt important for me to start with my father as this touchstone, and then telling the whole story all the way through to the birth of my first son was, in terms of the tradition, like this is where it's going to go in the future, not only specifically to him, but to the next generation. And looking around at all of us in my generation, and all of us were having kids at that point, young parents, I was looking at, well, how are people doing it? Are they continuing on with the traditions, or are they making new traditions? You know, and there was such a wide array of experiences. And that's something that I wanted to capture too, is just to say, well, how do you pass on this thing that existed a long time ago that you may not have a direct connection to, but you feel like it's important that they know it in some way, you know? And so there's that whole question of, what can you do? How do you pass it on? And so, yeah, that's why I wanted to end it with my son as well. And why I felt like it was important to kind of go back in time and in the structure of the book to move backwards, move forwards, move backwards, move forwards, because it felt like everything was interconnected. And trying to show that interconnectedness within the structure of the book was one of my goals.
That's excellent. And your answer leads me to another question, because I wonder if you consider your work a la Zora Neale Hurston autoethnography, because your answer made me think about Barracoon in terms of her interviewing and asking him, hey, tell me about yourself. And he started telling about his grandfather. And she's like, hey, I'm asking about you. She's like, I cannot tell you about myself until I tell you about her. Right.
That's great.
I wonder, do you see your work as ethnographic or autoethnographic?
Well, little known fact, I was an anthropology minor when I was in undergrad, and absolutely Zora Neale Hurston was one of my heroes, because I felt like my work was to go out into the communities and find the stories and then tell them. So even though I did it as a journalist, that definitely was part of my goal in storytelling about different people and their cultures, is to understand the culture enough to tell a story about them. So in a sense, yes.
Excellent. Sharon has something else. He says, I'm in Professor Burris's English 101 class, and we just read one of your pieces, Act Right, Raising a Black Boy from 6 to 7, and I loved it. Exclamation point, exclamation point. Also, we read an excerpt from Malcolm X's autobiography where he spoke about the very thing he just mentioned. I love that as well. Love, okay. Sharon.
So thank you, Professor Burris. I did not know you were reading that essay in your class. I don't know if she's on the call and I can't see, but yeah, that was one. Actually, I think I read over that essay maybe last weekend, and I'm just so emotional. Like, oh, hi, Professor Burris. I was crying at the end of that essay. Like I hadn't read it probably since it came out. And I was like, oh my gosh, it's terrible. I'm crying at my own work, but I was just like, almost like, this is unbelievable. It's about my first son when he was 6 years old and almost turning 7. And I was just really kind of lamenting that loss of innocence, not from a parent, not from a parent's point of view, looking at him as not being innocent anymore, but from society's point of view, looking at a little Black boy and not being able to see a little Black boy anymore, but seeing this threat. And I could see it happening already when he was just on the verge of 7 years old. And I was just so beside myself that could happen so early. And it just made me like, kind of sit around outside of myself and be like, how do I stop this? And I mean, there's really nothing that you can do, but it forced me to go to my computer and write an essay. There's that moment, that frustrating moment. I was like, I gotta write something.
Sure, absolutely. That's profound. And this is profound as well. With your permission,
Sharon, for that comment, that was great.
With your permission, Dr. Chico, I think we can wrap things up. Okay, so then I'll take it upon myself to thank everybody for coming. This was wonderful. Thank you so much for your writing and for your reading, Sufiya. It was wonderful. I think that you're getting a virtual round of applause right now, and we're getting thanks in the chat also. So thank you everybody for coming. Please pick up Heir to the Crescent Moon as well, and take care and stay safe. Everybody have a good evening.
Bye, thank you.